Hi, I'm Dr. Janice Morrow. Thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things related to mental health. Welcome. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. Today's guest is Detective Eric Threlkeld. He is a detective with the Eddy County Sheriff's Office in New Mexico, a law enforcement changemaker and domestic justice reform champion. He lectures all around the country on domestic violence, very experienced in this subject matter. And I thought that it was a timely topic because of everything going on with the Sean Combs P. Diddy trial. It's a very high profile case on domestic violence. I've been quite shocked, and I just wanted to talk to like an expert in the field who might not find any of this shocking, but for me. But anyway, we're grateful that Eric's here. And thank you, Eric. We'll just kind of go through the questions. There's no particular order, and it's just an outline. If I leave anything out, just feel free to please bring up anything that you feel is important, okay?
Okay.
I'm curious what pulled you into the domestic violence realm of detective work. Was there a personal experience with a loved one, or was it just something that you were called to, like from your years of experience?
It's mostly just from personal conviction and my experience in law enforcement. I didn't grow up in a violent home, so I don't have a backstory that drew me into this world. But I can tell you when my first exposure to domestic violence was as a police officer. And I had such a lack of training, a lack of understanding of the dynamics of the situation that I made a lot of mistakes. I went into scenes, I think things that we routinely train officers today not to do, I did them all. I showed up to calls by myself. I said things to people like, "Hey, don't make me come back here again, or somebody's going to go to jail. You need to get in your car and leave. And I don't have time to mess with this. And I don't understand. Why are you staying here? Why are you putting up with this kind of abuse?" Because I didn't understand how difficult it is for victims to actually leave violent relationships. And but I was smart enough even then to realize there's got to be a better way to handle this. This is not working, and we keep going back to the same homes over and over again. So gradually, over a period of time, I got some additional training, and after a few years, I worked my way up to a job. I changed agencies. I moved up to Colorado from New Mexico, and got a position with the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team for El Paso County, Colorado Springs area, and that really opened my eyes to the reality and the efficacy of multidiscipline approaches to handling these cases. And that I got to, it was a really amazing program. It was funded by the VAWA grants, the Violence Against Women Act, and it had an offsite location. We had three detectives. We had a patrol officer that rotated every 90 days. Somebody new would come into the unit. We had full-time nonprofit victim advocates. We had a full-time assistant district attorney assigned to our program. We had three different levels of cases. The money paid for a study to show that it was reducing recidivism. We're a national demonstration site. We had people coming from all over the U.S. to see our program, and I got the opportunity to travel around the U.S. as well and see other people's programs. But if you go on the internet today, go and Google the Colorado Springs Divert team. That team that I was in does no longer exist. The money went away. The partners that it all knew how well this was working withdrew their people, saying, "Well, we can't afford to keep this up if we don't have grant money to pay for it all." But what I tell people, what I tell officers and advocates in my training is, all of those partners are still there. But it's incumbent upon us to know each other, to reach out into our communities and understand that domestic violence is not a law enforcement problem, it's a community problem. And if we don't approach it from that multidiscipline aspect, we're not going to be very effective.
Well, I'd lo love to hear that. The multi I know my partner for this show, he worked with the Christ. He lives in Park City, Utah, and he worked as a personal experience subject when the police would go in when they're called for a mental health situation that's escalating, not so much domestic violence, but they bring in people in non-street clothes, I mean non-police clothes, someone, and it helps de-escalate the situation. He did, it was called the crisis response team, something like that, and they're bringing in anyway. It sounds like it's similar. So maybe I feel very naive. I've been very, very surprised at like what's been coming out of this trial. I try not to even watch it anymore, but it's on the news at night. As a female, I never experienced anything like this. I never saw it. I saw one woman get beat up in Hawaii when I lived there, which was horrifying. I had never even seen anybody be beat up like that. Are you? I'd like to, is this surprising to you at all or not at all? Have you seen this level of violence? Is this more common than people realize, like women being beaten up for so long on a regular basis, or not really?
Unfortunately, yes, it's very common.
Oh
Pretty
God.
much all the behaviors that are being described in that P. Diddy trial mirror patterns that we see repeatedly in long-term abusive relationships. That it maybe it shocks the conscience of the public because it involves a celebrity, but the reality is it's happening a lot more often than most people realize, and the significant sources, the resources that those people involved in this case have to bring all this to light, and that the press is making such a major focus on it. It's sad in one hand, but on the other hand, it's okay. It's putting a spotlight on this kind of coercive control, this kind of abusive behavior, because people need to understand that why it's so difficult for victims to get out of those situations. Yeah, if you look at Cassie Ventura's testimony, um, it's not about isolated incidents rather of violence. It's about the sustained campaign to dominate, to manipulate, to entrap someone in that state of fear and make them so dependent that they just can't break out of that situation. That emotional degradation, the forced sexual acts that she talked about, they're all hallmarks of a calculated system that abusers have. And things like controlling things that they wear, who they talk to, where they go, even what they believe about themselves. You've heard that term gaslighting, but making someone think that things aren't happening the way that it seems like right in front of you. This is what's occurring, but they don't believe it any longer because of this course of control that's going on.
I feel like almost shame because when all this, and I've worked in Hollywood for 20 years. My office was at two different movie studios, so I've been around entertainment a lot. I never heard a word. But I didn't believe it at first, to be honest, because I was very much, I guess, like a lot of people, like all these women that I think it's crazy that they can bring up claims 20 years later. She stayed for 15 years until I saw that video. I thought it was like a money grab, to be honest with you. Like maybe some of it, but how do you stay for And then I saw the video that the whole world saw of her being beaten up in the hallway and dragged and all that, and it changed me. I was humbled, embarrassed. I felt a lot of shame. And you kind of touched on that in your introductory statements. Do you think a lot of people are still like, I guess, feel like they just can't believe it? Like, well, I mean, it was kind of that way with Bill Cosby years ago, America's Dad. Nobody believed. And I was one of those people until there were numerous people that was like, I thought it was a money grab 30 years later. I just couldn't believe it. But
Even if you just take one dynamic, economic abuse as an example, where a victim who has or a survivor who doesn't have the ability to support themselves outside of that relationship, and they have nowhere to go, and you take away the abuser, and there's no money coming into the home, and that's a very real problem for most people. But I think this, if you look at the P. Diddy situation, I mean, it's a call for everybody to take this course of control seriously, to try to recognize the signs of it early on before it turns into physical violence, or you looked at that video that everyone saw. I mean, that was horrific, but I've seen much worse.
wow.
And
Well,
victims sometimes don't survive that kind of behavior, often don't survive. So it's frustrating for police officers as well because a lot of these behaviors, these coercive control behaviors, are not crimes. You know, you can call somebody horrible names and make them feel really, really bad about themselves, and it's not criminal in most states. There's a couple of states that have enacted coercive control laws, a few that have just come up with a definition of coercive control. But what I train officers to do to understand is they need to be recognizers of patterns
Mm.
that so so we take reports on every domestic violence call, whether an arrest is made or not, whether we have probable cause to arrest somebody or not, is irrelevant. We still are going to document it, and we got to ask the right questions of victims and offenders of the kinds of tactics that are being used, the words that are being used, the things that are being said to harm people and marginalize them and control them and isolate them, which may on the surface may not be criminal uh, individually, but it definitely shows that domestic violence is a pattern. It's a they're co-occurring crimes, and we can't just focus. For example, I go in and I'm talking to you and you have a black eye. Well, yeah, I want to know about that black eye. Tell me how that happened. How did it occur? But I also want to know what's happened in the past. When did the violence first begin? When did the coercive control tactics first kick in? And paint me a picture over the period of your relationship of where it led up to this black eye. And I also want to know, what do you think is going to happen after we leave here today?
Oh.
Because the police are not, we can't be there 24/7. We're not going to be parked out in front of your house, but we do have methods for identifying the risk of lethality. There's some really great tools out there. The one that my agency uses is called it's the Maryland model, the lethality assessment program that asks a series of 11 questions that we know if victims are answering yes to these, that it puts them at a higher risk of being killed. And, you know, things like, does he control most of your activities every day? Has he ever choked you or strangled you? A very, very high risk. Do you have a child that he knows isn't his? Is he unemployed? Has he ever threatened to kill himself before? Do you think he might kill you? We have to we want to ask those questions of intimate partner violence victims about what do you think might happen, because victims are their own best expert in really understanding the seriousness of the seriousness of the situation that they're in. Way better than I'm going to know, or any other person in their life that shows up there. They know, they live with that person every day. They know the warning signs when violent behavior is likely to increase, when they're at higher risk, when it might be much more unsafe than other times to get out of that situation. So we've got to give that autonomy to victims and let them know, I know you're the expert here on what you're going through, but I want to help guide you through this program, this system, to show you the behaviors that can be really high risk of lethality.
Is that considered part of the next question to delve into was things that you've been sharing on LinkedIn? It was something called Talk the 10 Days, 10 Red Flags, One Urgent Truth motif, and then you've been posting things every day. I think you just touched on a couple of could we go through those?
Sure. So that came about, this campaign on LinkedIn. I was approached by someone that's affiliated with organization in California, the that that really helped spearhead this new law that was passed on pretty much mandating law enforcement to look at that cases that appear to be suicide on the surface, if the victim is a victim of intimate partner violence, that they have to consider that case as suspicious. And there's 10 things that they're mandated to look for. So we created a series of posts on LinkedIn on each of the 10 to kind of highlight things that investigators should be looking at, and not just investigators, but anybody that's involved in that victim's life, if they understand that kind of the dynamics of that behavior, things that may be suspicious. So I think it's a great law that California got. I would like to see something like that across the United States. Um, but
I one of for our viewers, I mean, I had an experience just, it was like 15 years ago. I was just leaving an apartment complex one morning and I guess I made a call. There was somebody blocking the driveway, but it was they were moving furniture, so it looked like they were going to be there for a while. And it was Thanksgiving, and I was trying to leave to go visit my parents. And this man, but I pulled out. I think what the problem was, he was also in a work company's truck, so maybe he wasn't supposed to be using his work truck, but I made a mistake, which I would never do again. Well, I pulled out my camera and I was taking a photo. And next thing I know, he's like hitting me over the head with plywood. I've never been hit before, maybe. And it was terrifying. And like the police station was literally like, I don't know, yards away. Like I called the police, took them 30 minutes to get there. And they basically came, took a bunch of questions. And I didn't have any marks on me. And they said, there's nothing we can do. Like his wife was with him. His wife said he didn't touch her, like that I made it all up. I had no marks. I said, well, I'd still like to file a report or something. And they were like, well, we can, but now it's going to be dropped as soon as we get in front of a judge. There's no evidence. And as soon as I got to my parents, I mean, my dad's like, you're moving. We're moving you tomorrow. I mean, within 2 or 3 days, I was out of there in a hotel till I found he wasn't going to let me stay. But it was pretty scary. And then, but I was frustrated too. I felt like, really, there's nothing you can do. But I guess their hands are tied with no marks and no proof, no cameras. I don't know. But
Well,
that was my experience.
yeah, I don't know. The one thing that they certainly could have and should have done, in my view, is make a report. They shouldn't, you shouldn't have to ask them to make one. It should be mandatory that they make a report. You're witnessing a domestic violence situation. You're an eyewitness to it, and you were assaulted for in retaliation for that. So yeah, that definitely needs to be documented. And it's unfortunate that it wasn't. But it's important for agencies, I think, and there are many agencies in the country that don't have really um, comprehensive domestic violence policies that mandate officers take reports on every call. So I think that's important. And that there are certain things that you got to do. One analogy I use often is with officers is how much time do you spend investigating a traffic crash with no injuries? And sometimes it's, I don't know, half an hour, maybe you got to make a diagram, you're going to take photographs, you got to interview witnesses, who was in the car, what seat were they sitting in, did they have a seatbelt on or off, were there children involved? We do all of that, and in a lot of places, who are we really doing it for? For an insurance company, so they can decide whether who's going to pay the claim. We've got to look at domestic violence cases, investigating domestic violence cases as homicide prevention. And when we get those investigations, treat them like we would a homicide. And by what I mean by that is we're going to take good photographs. We're going to do detailed interviews. We're going to do follow-up photographs. If someone maybe isn't showing any bruising today, that doesn't mean it won't be there tomorrow. So we're going to follow up a day or two later. We're going to talk to the neighbors. We're going to draw a diagram. We're going to interview the suspect. Often we miss that, that we get to these calls and the suspect has fled.
Yeah.
So we make a report and then nobody ever interviews the guy. Maybe there's even a warrant for him and he gets arrested, but he still doesn't get interviewed. So we train officers, look, you got to make that effort to make sure we get that statement because it can be very, very helpful for the case. On the 10 red flags, so it's the Alliance for Hope International out of California. I actually went. They do some really excellent work around the country on training on investigating non-fatal strangulation and becoming a subject matter expert on the topic. And that's how I got involved with them several years ago. But they've expanded upon that. They now have a training program on, investigating hidden homicides. And as I said, they were instrumental in pushing the agenda on getting this law passed in California. And so I'll go over the 10 real quick. One is if the crime scene has been altered in some way, and it's an intimate partner violence. There's been a history of intimate partner violence in this home. That's a red flag. It's not just a coincidence. We want to make sure that we're looking at that scene very, very carefully. Why was it altered? Who altered it? It's really incumbent upon officers to ask those right questions. Looking for missing objects, stage injuries, the body's been manipulated in some way, moved from where it was originally located. Looking for alterations that could be indication of someone trying to hide the truth or to make it look like it's an accident or maybe a suicide. Another one is partner has control of the crime scene before the police arrive. That can be a real red flag. Um, the abusers will use this as an opportunity to tamper with evidence, try to change the narrative of what may be readily apparent, might remove weapons, clean up blood. Those are all major red flags on these kinds of investigations. Is the partner, the intimate partner, the last person to see the victim alive?
Mm.
Uh, So yeah, that's suspicious. So let's treat it like it's suspicious, and let's indicate that in our reports, making sure that we're
Thorough.
um, building that history about prior abuse or prior coercive behavior. And that's why I use this as an example with officers. It's like, see, that's why we got to document this. Maybe you were there and you didn't have enough to make an arrest, didn't rise to the level of physical abuse or a violation of criminal statute, but that we show that there's a pattern, that there's a history. When we end up with this homicide, now we can go back and review those reports and build a much stronger case for prosecution. Another one is it's to treat an apparent suicide as suspicious if the victim's been previously strangled by their partner. So I can tell you that studies show that someone who's been strangled by their partner is at a minimum of a 750% greater likelihood that they're later going to be killed by that partner if they're a victim of non-fatal strangulation. And it doesn't mean they're going to be strangled. They could be killed lots of other ways, but that's just a serious red flag. So if we know that they're a victim of that, we want to be very suspicious on those cases. Um,
Oh.
was the victim found by the current or a previous partner? Did I came to visit and found her dead. That's a red flag. We'll make sure that we're looking at those closely, um, ensuring that it's not just a coincidence. Um, the understanding that the most dangerous place for a victim to be is in her own home. That's statistics from the United Nations, and that's not just in the United States, it's across the world. Much more likely to die in your own home than you are anywhere else. So that if that's where the crime has occurred, that kind of fits, right? Or that's where the body is located, and you're seeing maybe it seems like a suicide on the surface. Let's look really carefully. It should raise investigative concern because we know, hey, that's a high risk environment for many women. Um, a history of domestic violence is a critical indicator for staged homicides. Again, documenting those cases along the path, it helps so much. But if we know that we've got someone who's deceased and there's intimate partner violence, there's a history of it, it's a critical red flag. Did the victim express that she wanted to get out of that relationship before this death occurred? Another high risk indicator, a serious red flag. We want to look beyond the obvious on those things. Did she have a desire to leave? Because we know statistically the most dangerous time for a victim is when they decide, yes, I'm done, I'm out of here, I got it together, I'm moving on. Because that's when that power and control that a perpetrator has they're losing it. They've lost control of it. They've lost a grip on what they believe that they had, and it puts victims at serious risk of being killed. Um, and does it look like it's a suicide or an accident? And we know that there's a history of family violence. That's a suspicion. That is suspicious. It's one of the 10 red flags. Um, we got to be trained to look for those inconsistencies and question the narratives that people are giving us, and not just to accept it as face value. Um, did the victim die unexpectedly or prematurely?
Mm.
I came home, she was in her bed, she was dead. I don't know. We want to make sure, we want to ensure that autopsies are being done on those cases and looking for uh, signs that it's not a suicide. Sometimes, in my experience, medical investigators can miss that. And it's incumbent upon investigators to put pressure on medical investigators, whatever your system is in your state, whatever they're called, to say, we really need an autopsy done on this situation. So they understand there is a history of intimate partner violence with this person. So we want, maybe it looks like clearly on the surface, it looks like a hanging or a drowning, a suffocation. That's self-induced, but we need that autopsy. We need those toxicology reports to be done, the blood tests to be done, and demanding that in these types of investigations, like we would on a homicide. Um, Another one is, well, I think, did I cover all 10? I kind of lost track. Making sure that,
I wasn't counting, but yeah,
yeah,
you.
I think I got the 10.
Well, thank you. You mentioned well, there were two women that I knew. The week I graduated from chiropractor school, it was devastating. Our school librarian, her daughter, I guess, had been in a volatile relationship. It was the back and forth thing. I'm leaving, going to my mom's, and then when she finally moved out, he she agreed to meet him like one last time for lunch. And so I've seen that now with her situation, and then a woman I interviewed last year, Justice for Rosario. Her daughter was murdered when she went back to meet with the boyfriend one last time. Like the parents did offered to go with her, but what are your thoughts on that? Like to me, that seems like a huge like, and I know that women are or people are drawn to that like, oh, well, I don't want to be a total horrible a completely horrible person. Maybe I should go meet with them one last time for closure. But that
If I had the opportunity to advise someone in that kind of a situation where there's been violence or threats of violence, and it's like, hey, come on, I want one more visit. I just want to say goodbye. I would have a safety plan in mind. If you insist upon doing it, my recommendation would be don't do it. Just talk on the phone. But if you're going to do it, have a safety plan. Bring someone with you. Have somebody who's a witness, and have a plan on how you're going to get it. Don't go to a place where you know you could be cornered and make it be difficult to escape from. Making sure that you're as safe as possible, because you're right, that's kind of a frequent story that you hear where they get lured back. I finally got away. Now he's luring me back. I'm just gonna get, I feel bad. I feel sorry for him. I still love him. I'm gonna give him one more opportunity, or I'm just gonna go say goodbye, and that's it. And that literally is it. So you gotta have a plan.
You just made me think of a book. I just want to mention it for this discussion for women out there. There was I don't know what his background was. I think he worked in law enforcement or the government, but there was a man named Gavin DeBecker. I saw him like 20 years ago on Oprah. I don't know if you've heard that name. And he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. And basically the gist of the book, I highly recommend every woman out there read it, but it was all about how women get we're all every species has like a gut feeling and instinct like dogs will growl and cats hiss and like raise their back. But he said women are one of the only species that will like second guess those instincts, and it often gets them into trouble. Like oh, I don't want to be seen as a bitch or a difficult person. Like somebody offers, and the book is full of examples of stories of women like just a typical one is a woman, maybe you're unloading your car and your groceries and you're trying to not do 4 trips, so you've got to, and a guy comes up but you just feel uncomfortable and he's like, let me help you with that. You know you're struggling there, I'll help. And she's like, no, no, I got it. And he's like, oh, come on, let me help you. And she goes against those instincts, helps her with the groceries, and of course it has a tragic situation after. But the whole book is about women, how you got to listen to these feelings, don't second guess them, and go with your gut and your instincts. But it was a great book. Have you ever heard of this one?
I've read it. I've read it. Yes, it's really good.
The gift of
I
fear.
highly recommend it, not just for women, but for anybody, men as well, because I think humans, we kind of tend to second guess. You get that hair on the back of your neck raising up feeling, and you ignore it, and you walk into some situation that, and something bad happens. You're like, right before that happened, I knew I had this feeling something bad was going to happen, and I walked in there anyway. We really, like you said, we really got to trust our gut
Right.
instincts.
With your guy. Well, let's talk about, there's so much to cover. Let's talk about Safe Horizon Strategies. Tell us what you do and what your mission is. I think this is your company, or
Yes,
tell us about Safe Horizon Strategies.
this is really new. We're just getting it off the ground. I've been doing over the years. I've done a lot of training, uh, sometimes on duty, sometimes off duty, and you might not realize it, but I am getting to that age where I could retire. So I've been thinking, what am I going to do after I retire? And maybe I want to make a little more headway into the training side of things. And so I created Safe Horizon Strategies, which really is the mission of that is to develop a survivor-centered, community-based responses to domestic violence. Help organizations build those. It could be law enforcement, it could be nonprofits, but looking at the best practices in victim and advocacy, managing cases, that multidisciplinary coordination, and public education as well. So providing consulting, training, strategic support for law enforcement and communities in general. I mean, there's some major employers that have, especially there's some really big corporations that could really benefit from that kind of training, and even small businesses as well. Just understanding the dynamics of intimate partner violence, workplace violence, things along those lines.
And it sounds like you go around the country. Like I saw that you had just spoken. There was a conference on an annual conference, violence against women. And it sounds like you just recently went there and spoke. You go around the
Yeah,
country.
that was really an amazing opportunity, and I got to give a shout out to Leslie Morgan Steiner, who was my co-presenter at the conference. She's written a really wonderful book as well. It's called Crazy Love, about her extremely violent relationship with her ex-husband and how she was managed to escape from that situation. She's got a great TED Talk. I met Leslie because of that TED Talk. I use it quite a bit in my training as a great example of how difficult it is for victims to get out of those relationships. And I contacted her on LinkedIn. I sent her a message. Hey, just want to let you know, I really appreciate this YouTube video. It was a TED Talk video that she had done, and let you know I use it a lot in my training. And she very kindly wrote back almost immediately, oh, that's wonderful. And then she sent me another video here. You can use this one too. And it's where she's thanking the police officers that helped her get out of the situation she was in. And we ended up meeting in person at the conference, the Crimes Against Women conference last year, which I would also highly promote. If you have a strong interest in this field, go to Dallas. Every year, the conference is held there at the Marriott downtown Dallas. Uh, just a plethora of amazing speakers. But we met there, and then shortly after that, she reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in co-presenting with me?" And so we did that. We went to the conference. We gave a presentation on the victim's perspective of the police and the police's perspective of victims on domestic violence calls, and kind of comparing and contrasting what our roles are and how we can sometimes misinterpret what each other are saying, and kind of explore some ways to make that relationship more productive. And I'll give you some examples. Like for police officers, we tend to, we maybe tend to be a little bit robotic and maybe closed off, and we're very, matter of fact, and sometimes not very trauma informed on how to ask questions. And we really like things to be chronological. And so when we're talking to people, we want you to start at the beginning of what happened and then walk us through the steps. I said, this is what happened first, this is what happened second. But the reality is, you're dealing so often with people who have experienced significant trauma. Maybe it just occurred, and they're not going to talk to you in a chronological manner. And we've got to understand that. We've got to override that urge to interrupt people and say, well, hold on, wait. Well, I've seen this. I did it in my past. You start talking to me, you're telling me things about how you feel about what's occurred to you. And it's so important to know that. But I'm thinking, I need to see your ID. So I'll you were like, hey, you got an ID with you? And I interrupt your train of thought. And I may have interrupted something that was so important, something that you're never going to say again. And I just missed it, right? So I'm like getting your ID, and then I'm running your name on the radio, and I'm listening for the dispatcher to tell me if, you have any warrants for your arrest. And I'm not listening carefully to what you're telling me. So what we're training officers is got to stop doing that. Understand that victims are going to focus on what's most important to them at that moment, which may not be what you're most interested in. Let them tell their story. Let them go all the way through it if possible. Don't interrupt. We can always go back and walk them through step by step. Um, and Leslie did a really good job of explaining how we victims are maybe have had really bad interactions with the police in the past, where they've told their story and they've tried to be as cooperative as possible, and the case went nowhere. There was no prosecution. The offender wasn't held accountable, and so they don't really trust the system. They don't trust the police, and we've got to understand that that's a reality. So that was just one example. There were many others, but overall, I think it was really well received.
Well, it sounds very interesting. I'm going to read that book. You touched on a little bit of this earlier, but you in some of your posts, I've heard you talk about there's different types of domestic violence, like economic, sexual, psychological. If you want to talk a little bit about that, because when I was researching for this interview, trying to find information, things that you had talked about and just stats out there. It made me think I have a really bad situation with an older brother, and he had moved into my mom's house and before she passed for a few years after, but there was drug activity. So if things just went south, it was a very scary situation. I had to evict him, and there was a lot of violence. But to your point, like he never laid a hand on my mom, but there was a lot of other types. And researching for this, it just brought it all back up, like a lot, the threats. I'm going to kill the dog. I'm going to kill your bird. He was threatened to kill me because she knows that that would scare her. Um,
Right.
so if you could talk about these, like you touched on economic, because people are they're dependent on them, and maybe they don't have the job skills to support themselves, but the psychological and the sexual that you've seen in your experience.
So there's a tool that I use quite a bit in training. It's been around since the early 80s, I believe. It's called the power and control wheel. And if you look it up on the internet, it's easy to find. It's a diagram that kind of looks like a big pizza with slices, and it kind of touches on not all, but most of the tactics that abusers will use in violent relationships. It was really designed for victim advocates to be able to talk with victims and help them recognize these behaviors as this is not a healthy relationship if these kind of things are going on. And law enforcement has adopted it in many cases. So it breaks the abuse down into 8 different categories: using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation,
Mm.
minimizing, denying, and blaming, or we use that term gaslighting a lot right now, using children, male privilege, and economic abuse, and then the last one is using coercion and threats. And you'll see that a lot of these tactics overlap, like these pieces of the wheel overlap with each other. But uh, at the center of it is the power and control. That's what it's all about, is controlling that situation. And we know that we got to understand clearly that domestic violence is sexual violence, physical violence, and we've got to ask the right questions when they're investigating these cases. And I'll give you some examples. You mentioned several things: using intimidation, like making her afraid by making threats against other people that are important to that victim, or their animals. We know there's a close correlation with people who abuse animals, abuse other people. It's a powerful weapon to say, I'm gonna injure the animal that you love so much. Making someone afraid just by using a look. you know, that look that some people can give that is so intimidating and so powerful. That's why we train officers. It's so important to separate victims and offenders from each other when you're doing those interviews at the scene, so they can't give that look or that tone of voice. Like you can have an offender who can just say a victim's name with a certain tone and certain inflection that puts her in great fear. So we want to separate them far enough that they can't hear each other, can't see each other. But it's very complex for officers because we've also got to keep an eye on where's my partner because I need to stay safe.
Yeah, super
And then
interesting.
you have environments where there's other family members around, or there's children around, or you have neighbors that are getting involved. And so you've got to keep all of that under control, and it can be really problematic. Um, if you look at emotional abuse, I talked about a lot of these earlier, but putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, uh, guilt, playing those mind games, and in my experience, most of the victims I've talked to over the 30 plus years I've been doing this will tell you this that kind of stuff that they is much more damaging to them than even much of the physical abuse, the put downs and the name calling. Isolation is another tactic that happens often. And what I mean by that is like controlling what she does, who she sees, who she talks to, what she reads, whether she gets to have a cell phone or not,
Oh,
whether she gets to drive a car or not, whether she's allowed to have a job, who her friends are going to be. And often we offenders will use jealousy as that's why it makes me jealous when you do this or you do that. Using children. It's so it's so unfortunate, but you know, I see it time and again where parents will use children to pass hurtful messages on to the other one. They've separated. They're living separately. They have shared custody with kids, and they're like, tell your mom this or tell your dad that, and it's harmful, hurtful messages, and you draw kids into the middle of it. That's just one version, but uh, using those visitations to harass the other party, threatening to take children away. I don't know how it is. You're in California, right? I don't know how it is there, but in New Mexico, if you call the 800 number for children, youth, and families and make an anonymous complaint about somebody abusing their kids, somebody's going to show up at your house and knock on the door and start asking you questions. So then imagine that it's somebody that you know, an intimate partner who says, I have firsthand knowledge of this, and they're willing to make that kind of a statement that can put parents in great fear that they might actually lose their kids, even though it's not true, even though it's false information. So that's really powerful. Or issues of, if you talk to the police, I'll get you deported. If you have somebody who's here
wow.
with they're an undocumented immigrant, for example, that's a very real threat. I think that's even more in jeopardy these days than it ever has been, um, because it's just becoming very problematic. Where victims, I think, are going to be much less likely to report just out of fear that they're going to get deported. Um, Using male privilege, treating someone like a servant, making I'm the master of the house. I control everything. I'll make all the decisions on how money's going to be spent. Um, def, I'm the one who defines the roles. That's what we're talking about there. Economic abuse. You'll see how these overlap, right? Keeping her from getting a job, making her ask for money or an allowance, um, not letting her have access to the family income. It's a great tool. It's easy to
What
find.
was it called again?
The power and control wheel.
Power control role. Okay. Good thoughts on that. You have mentioned in a couple of your talks that I saw that you just bring up you're raising awareness how the proposed Department of Justice budget cuts is going to affect Office of Violence Against Women. Can you just talk about some of the services like because I when I was listening to you, I didn't even really I never think about it because I don't ever use that office or services like
Right.
what they do
Well, I
and
think first of all, it's important to understand that the issue at the heart of what's undermining our national response to domestic violence. Uh, because of the work. It's because of the work of supporting survivors. It doesn't run on passion alone, right? It takes money to fund these programs. It requires stability. It requires trained professionals. We need safe housing. We need legal assistance. We need an infrastructure that is very, very reliant on federal funding, and it's at great risk right now. The Office of Violence Against Women, for example, funds an entire ecosystem of domestic violence prevention, response to. They offer support for crisis shelters, battered family shelters, transitional housing. I was talking with a director of a program in northern New Mexico just this morning about they're so fearful that they're going to lose all their transitional housing, which is a big part of what their program does. It's if we don't have money to pay rent on those places, they're going to be gone. And there's dozens. And this is a small community. There's going to be dozens of people who don't have a place to live because of that funding. Those then there's they are lifelines, and I mean that figuratively, literally, they are lifelines. Um, you look at this funding being cut off, it freezes grants, it delays applications. There's right now a lot of unclear communication with the Department of Justice, and unfortunately, I think a lot of it's this politically motivated restrictions that are putting victims and survivors at much greater risk. But you look at things like crisis hotlines, court advocacy for survivors, um, paying salaries for domestic violence prosecutors and detectives, trauma counseling, um, transitional housing, abuser intervention programs. Um, that's one of the few tools that we have that's that's effective is so you have somebody who's been convicted of a domestic violence crime or in lieu of going to jail, one of the requirements is they're going to go learn how to not be an abuser. Well, that grant money pays for those kinds of programs. Those things will go away as well. Food pantries, paying utility payments for victims of domestic violence are dependent on these programs. Um, so it's
A lot more than people realize, like how it
yeah,
can,
it
who can be
it really is.
affected. What are your thoughts in my own personal experience? I feel like restraining orders are they're kind of useless if somebody really wants to get you. That's just been my own experience with restraining orders. Do you, maybe it's a minor deterrent, but I do feel strongly that if somebody really wants to get you, they will. So what are your thoughts? And you don't, if it's too controversial, what are your thoughts on women owning guns and being trained and yeah, because
Let me talk a little bit about the protective order thing because I think it's often misunderstood how important those documents are. Um, it's a vital legal tool. But as you said, it's just a piece of paper if it's not enforced and if people don't know that it exists. So it depends a lot on the mindset of the abuser. But if I serve a protective order on an abuser and he violates it, that's a huge red flag. So we've got to go one as law enforcement, when we get those reports that the order's been violated, those people need to be arrested. They need to be held accountable, taken to jail and told, I told you so. I told you when I served this order on you, if you violate it, we will hold you accountable. And many times we miss that. And many times those violations aren't reported. Victims, for
um,
whatever reason, don't. Maybe they feel like I don't want him to go to jail, or people aren't aware that the order exists. Like they saw a clear violation, but they didn't even know it was a violation. So it's a behavioral red flag. It's a lethality indicator. If violating a protective order shows it's not just a disregard for the law, but it's an obsessive need for control. If you're willing to say, I don't care what the judge says, I'm going to do what I want. That it shows that they're not going to stop until they regain dominance or till they're able to inflict punishment on somebody for getting that order in the first place. Um, it's uh, it's a integral question in most all of the lethality assessment tools. If they violated a protective order, it's a high risk of lethality. So saying that it's not effective,
That,
yeah, if violating it, we need to have a coordinated response to helping victims stay safe. And I use the term layered safety planning. So one, you got to report it to the police. Hey, they violated the order. Some agencies will be able to offer things like extra patrols for your house. If you just can't get out of the house you're in, but doing welfare checks, extra patrols for your home. Advocates can assist with maybe a victim doesn't have a mobile phone. They can assist with emergency phones. Maybe they have funding for relocating somebody, helping them get securing other housing opportunities. Some educating victims about technological safety, because so they understand how they may be
mm,
tracked by
mm.
an offender.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. These
Everywhere you go with that phone, it's
well,
following
and also these little Apple AirTags. Now, somebody gave me a couple. They look like a quarter, so you could literally put them. I mean, it could be in your trunk in your car. They're so easy to hide now. I mean, yeah, yeah,
you.
and
Right.
tracking is.
So you mentioned firearms as a form of protection. That's one of the most complicated and probably most emotionally charged questions that we encounter in the domestic violence field. Um, and I would start by saying that every survivor situation is different, and they have to make the personal safety decisions for themselves, and that includes owning a firearm. But you got to be thoughtful. You got to have access to all the information. You got to have training. You got to have some support if you're going to purchase a firearm. It can put you at greater risk having that firearm than not having it if you're not prepared, if you're not trained, and you don't know what you're going to do with that gun if something is going on. Um, it's especially in intimate partner violence situations. We know statistically, just having a gun in the home, whether it increases your risk of lethality by 500% just because the gun is there. Um, so
That's shocking,
it,
scary.
it, it can that firearm can be taken away from you. It can be used against you. You think how most abusers are very familiar with their victims. They know their habits, they know their routines, they know their weaknesses. They're going to know whether you've had training with that weapon or not, whether you're really prepared to use it or not. Do you have secure storage for that weapon so children don't get a hold of it? So that strangers coming into your home, guests, don't have access to it. We've seen that happen so often. Owning a firearm doesn't eliminate risk. It changes your risk.
Oh,
Sometimes maybe for the better, sometimes for the worse. It may give you this psychological sense of control, but it can also increase your anxiety just having it in the home, especially if you haven't really been trained. And it can lead to fatal consequences. So I can use the analogy of police officers. We spend an inordinate amount of time training with firearms. That's one of the major components of any police academy. We're required to be retrained in some states several times a year. A lot of officers practice on their own, off duty. They're really intimately familiar with their firearms, and still we miss our target more often than we would like to admit sometimes, even with all that training, and bad things happen when guns are around. So we got to make sure that if you're going to use that as a tool, that you're really prepared for the consequences. Um, Making those and understanding too that if you're a victim of trauma,
mm,
which so often domestic violence is, it's traumatic, that can affect your decision making under pressure. So understanding that, living if you're living in a constant state of fear, that you're able to not overreact to a situation, and with a firearm in the mix, that can make it much more difficult for some people. Having that, I'll just pull the trigger, it's going to fix everything. It may not. It may make it a lot worse. So I can't say that it's the best answer for everybody. It is an independent decision that everybody's got to make for themselves.
my dad passed about 13 years ago, and he had been a hunter, so he had lots of rifles and shotguns, and I had three brothers at the time. But one had passed away. He was a hunter in Utah, so he would have gotten the guns. Then the older brother had felonies, so dad's like, I can't give any to him. So he gave them all to my brother in Hawaii, and he didn't give me any. And he said, I know you think because I wanted one for self-defense. And he said, I know you think I'm being sexist and has nothing to do with that. I like know you, you're my daughter. And he brought up a lot of things that you just said. Like, well, mostly that he said, I do not think that you would be able to shoot someone. And I think that they would use it against you and you'd be killed. So he would, he just said, keep yourself out of dangerous situations, carry some pepper spray. So, I mean, that was a long time ago. And then just this last December when I was in Hawaii, my friends, because I've been toying, I go up and down. I'll get close to, once in a while, something really bad will happen in the media, and I'm like, I really need to get a gun. I live alone. And then I go up and down. I couldn't decide between a little gun or a big gun. I've been to a couple gun shops. So my friends took me shooting so I could try different guns. They're very experienced. We went to a gun range in Hawaii. But I know actually shooting, I probably will go again, but it was a little scary. I've never shot a gun before. It felt for me, to your point, like a very unnatural kind of a feeling. Like I don't know if I could, it was a lot bigger and bulkier than and louder than I thought. Just the whole experience. Well, it made me what I kept thinking, and we had the headphones on, but I kept thinking how scary because I've never been in a situation where there was like a mass shooting, right? And how terrifying because it was so loud at the gun range. Just when we shot, it wasn't, we were the only ones in there. I didn't know how loud, like how scary that must be. Besides all the other things that you might die, just the sound of it. It was kind of just a weird experience if you've never shot a gun. But I'm glad that they took me because I wanted to go with somebody who knew what they were doing, right? And I don't want to buy. But and thanks for bringing up all those nuances, things to think about. Um, I guess I want to talk about just a little bit about the issue of men coming forward because some men, it's not all women that are abused. And then we touched on it earlier, but this thing about strangulation for people out there that have never heard of this. I only recently heard of this. Like the strangulation thing is becoming very popular in sex, especially in the younger generations. And I didn't know this was a thing. It sounds crazy to me, does, but it's happening a lot. So let's talk about that a little bit. What you've seen and yeah, your thoughts on this whole thing. Because
Yeah,
you,
I think it's important for people to understand that even if it's done consensually, strangulation can cause serious irreparable damage. And we know in studies that have been done with victims in intimate partner violence relations where they've been strangled repeatedly over time, it can cause long-ranging effects with memory loss. They were even seeing early onset of Alzheimer's. They're seeing um, serious internal injuries that, and just understanding, even if it's consensual, doesn't mean you're not really putting yourself at great risk of death or long term injury. So and often there's not going to be physical signs. Only about half the time for are you going to see a visible bruising from strangulation, but there can be serious internal injuries, and that's why we train nurses and doctors the importance of CT scans and being able to look inside the throat for damage that you are not going to see on the surface. That's why we train officers to, if there's some initial redness, taking photographs of that right away because it won't last. It's going to go away pretty quickly. And if there's bruising, it may be days later that it's going to surface. And educating victims about how lethal this is and encouraging them to go get treated medically, because you can die days later. You can be
oh,
if you strangled to unconsciousness, you lose bodily control. Um, you can lose control of urination and defecation. You can um, be at a very high risk of dying. You're within seconds of dying if you've been strangled to unconsciousness. That's a reality. So we train officers, like even with victims who are unwilling to get to talk to you, to make a statement. We've got to at least leave them with that knowledge that, hey, this is high risk of lethality behavior. Please, if you don't want to come with me, go see a doctor on your own. Go to the emergency room, get examined, and for this phenomenon that's going on with in the porn industry and the people doing this quote unquote um, uh, consensually, they really need to understand that it's highly lethal.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even know it was a thing until one of my patients just a few months ago. Yeah, well, actually, following some domestic violence advocates from Australia, I guess they're having a real big problem down in Australia. But I didn't know it was so, all these things you just mentioned. Well, we're kind of winding it down. Is there anything like parting thoughts that you would, I know you could just probably share so many stories, but like if you could parting words of advice for women, young women as far as like seeing red flags in men or someone, a potential partner that they could do or read or things to really be aware of or mindful of in all of your experience that are getting so many women into trouble.
Yeah. I guess if I had to pick one thing, it would probably be educate yourself on the dynamics of coercive control. Understand all of those things that may seem somewhat innocuous in the beginning, look at them as the red flags that they are. If someone is minimizing, denying, and blaming, if they are gaslighting you, if they are saying hurtful, demeaning things to you, uh, and even if there's no hands-on, uh, really reevaluate that situation that you're in. Um, I think that education really needs to start at a very young age. I see in years past, I was a school resource officer, and I saw that kind of behavior in middle school, that coercive controlling behavior with young boys using against girls, and sometimes the other way as well. And so it's important that we educate our kids to recognize these signs, and hopefully we can mitigate that as they get older. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Just
Well,
let's about it. Let's educate each other.
I very much appreciate your time today. I know you're busy.
Sure.
Okay, and I'll keep following you on LinkedIn. I'm learning a lot.
Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Have a great happy Father's Day if you're a father. That's coming up
Thank
soon.
you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. Hope to see you next week and please share with your friends.